Lips grew pale, as one by one fate decreed, or so it seemed, every morsel of evidence which would exonerate Frederick should fall from beneath her feet and disappear. Even Mr. Lennox's well-regulated professional voice took a softer, tenderer tone as he drew near to the extinction of the last hope. It was not that Margaret had not been perfectly aware of the result before. It was only that the details of each successive disappointment came with such relentless minuteness to quench all hope, that she at last fairly gave way to tears. Mr. Lennox stopped reading. "I had better not go on," said he in a concerned voice. "It was a foolish proposal of mine. Lieutenant Hale," and even this giving him the title of the service from which he had been so harshly expelled, was soothing to Margaret. "Lieutenant Hale is happy now, more secure in fortune and future prospects he could ever been in the Navy, and he has doubtless adopted his wife's country as his own." "That is it," said Margaret. "It seems so selfish in me to regret it," trying to smile, "and yet he is lost to me, and I am so lonely." Mr. Lennox turned over his papers and wished he were as rich and prosperous as he believed he should be some day. Mr. Bell blew his nose, but otherwise he kept silence, and Margaret, in a minute or two, had apparently recovered her usual composure. She thanked Mr. Lennox very courteously for his trouble, all the more courteously and graciously because she was conscious that, by her behavior, he might probably be led to imagine he had given her needless pain. Yet it was pain she would not have been without. Mr. Bell came up to wish her goodbye. "Margaret," said he as he fumbled with his gloves, "I'm going down to Helston tomorrow to look at the old place. Would you like to come with me, or would it give you too much pain? Speak out, don't be afraid." "Oh, Mr. Bell," said she, and could say no more. But she took his old gouty hand and kissed it. Come, that's enough," said he, reddening with awkwardness. "I suppose your Aunt Shaw will trust you with me. We'll go tomorrow morning, and we shall get there about 2 o'clock, I fancy. We'll take a snack, order dinner at the little inn, the Leonard Arms it used to be, and go and get an appetite in the forest. Can you stand up, Margaret? It will be a trial, I know, to both of us, but it will be pleasure to me, at least. And there we'll dine. It will be but doe venison if we can get it at all, and then I'll take my nap while you go out and see old friends. I'll give you back safe and sound, barring railway accidents, and I'll insure your life for £1,000 before starting, which may be some comfort to your relations. But otherwise I'll bring you back to Mrs. Shaw by lunchtime on Friday. So if you say yes, I'll just go upstairs and propose it." "It's no use my trying to say how much I shall like it," said Margaret through her tears. "Well then, prove your gratitude by keeping those fountains of yours dry for the next 2 days. If you don't, I shall feel queer myself about the lachrymal ducts, and I don't like that." "I won't cry a drop," said Margaret, winking her eyes shut to shake the tears off her eyelashes and forcing a smile. "There's my good girl. We'll go upstairs and settle it all." Margaret was in a state of almost trembling eagerness, while Mr. Bell discussed his plan with her and Shaw, who was first startled, then doubtful, and perplexed, but in the end yielding to the rough force of Mr. Bell's words than to her own conviction. For to the last, whether it was right or wrong, proper or improper, she could not settle to her own satisfaction. Till Margaret's first turn, the happy fulfillment of the project gave her decision enough to say, she was sure it had been very kind thought of Mr. Bell's, and just what she herself had been wishing for Margaret, as giving her the very change which she required after all the anxious time she had had. End of chapter 45. I wasn't kidding that was a pretty short one. But just in time, we have a Taurus, and the bot is actually showing us the right Pokemon right now. Hell yeah. We love that. Feel free to Poke-catch, y'all. So we can infer that the very long chapter that we're going to read will be a journey to Helston for the first time since the very earliest chapters of the book. Let me see. if we're looking at what was the last day that they had in Helston, it was chapter 6. That's when they have like packed up their stuff. They're going to the train station. They're heading towards Milton Northern. So this is 40 chapters later. We're returning to the south of England. So, kind of a big event. Once this Pokemon resolves, we'll jump on into our next chapter, chapter 46. Arcari and Jiro, fast balls. That was the trick. Great job. All right, you guys. Back we go, jumping on in to our final chapter of the night. This one's a little bit of a doozy, so bear with me. I'm going to, if the battle runs, I will try and start it as soon as I can. And yeah, I will check back with you at the end of chapter 46. Once and now. So on those happy days of yore, oft as I dare to dwell once more, still must I miss the friends so tried whom death has severed from my side. But ever when true friendship binds, spirit is that spirit finds. In spirit then our bliss we found, in spirit yet to them I'm bound. Oland. Margaret was ready long before the appointed time, and had leisure enough to cry a little quietly when unobserved, and to smile brightly when anyone looked at her. Her last alarm was lest they should be too late and miss the train, but no, they were all in time. She breathed freely and happily at length, seated in the carriage opposite to Mr. Bell and whirling away past the known stations, seeing the old south country towns and hamlets sleeping in the warm light of the pure sun, which gave a yet ruddier color to the tiled roofs, so different to the cold slates of the north. Broods of pigeons hovered around these peaked, quaint gables, slowly settling here and there, ruffling their soft, shiny feathers as if exposing every fiber to the delicious warmth. There were few people about at the stations, which seemed almost as if they were lazily content to wish to travel. None of the bustle and stir that Margaret had noticed in her 2 journeys for London and Northwestern Line. Later on in the year, the line of railways should be stirring and alive with rich pleasure seekers, but as to the constant going to and fro of busy tradespeople, it would always be widely different from the northern lines. Here, a spectator or two stood loungingly at every station with his hands in his pockets, so absorbed in the simple act of watching, it made the travelers wonder what he could find to do when the train whirled away, and only the blank of a railway, some sheds, and a distant field or two were left for him to gaze upon. The hot air danced over the golden stillness of the land. Farm after farm was left behind, each reminding Margaret of German idylls, of Herman and Dorothy, of Evangeline. From this waking dream she was roused. Was the place to leave the train and take the fly to Helston? And now sharper feelings came shooting through her heart. Whether pain or pleasure, she could hardly tell. Every mile was redolent of associations which she would not have missed for the world, but each of which made her cry upon the days that are no more with ineffable longing. The last time she had passed along this road was when she had left it with her father and mother. The day, the season, had been gloomy, and she herself hopeless, but they were there with her. Now she was alone, an orphan, and they, strangely, had gone away from her and vanished from the face of the earth. It hurt her to see Helston Road so flooded in the sunlight, and every turn and every familiar tree so precisely the same in its summer glory as it had been in former years. Nature felt no change, and was ever young. Mr. Bell knew something of what would be passing through her mind, wisely and kindly held his tongue. They drove up to the Leonard Arms, half farmhouse, half inn, standing a little apart from the road, as much as to say that the host did not so depend on the custom of travelers as to have a court by any obtrusiveness. They, rather, must seek him out. The house fronted the village green, and right before it stood an immemorial lime tree, benched all around in some hidden recesses of whose leafy wealth hung the grim exterior of the Leonards. The door of the inn stood wide open, but there was no hospitable hurry to receive the travelers. When the landlady did appear, they might have extracted many an article first. She gave them a kind welcome, almost as if they had been invited guests, and apologized for her coming had been so delayed, by saying that it was hay time and the provisions for the men had to be sent afield. She had been too busy packing up the baskets to hear the noise of wheels over the road, which, since they left the highway, ran over soft turf. "Why, bless me," exclaimed she, as the end of her apology a glint of sunshine showed her Margaret's face, and hitherto unobserved in that shady parlor. "It's Miss Hale, Jenny," said she, running to the door, calling to her daughter. "Come here, come directly, it's Miss Hale." And she went up to Margaret and shook hands with the motherly fondness. "How are you all? How is the vicar? How is Miss Dixon? The vicar, above all. God bless him, we have never ceased to be sorry he left." Margaret tried to speak and tell of her father's death. Of her mother's it was evident that Miss Purkis was aware, from her omission of her name. But she choked on the effort, and could only touch her deep mourning and say the word, "Papa." "Surely it's never so," said Miss Purkis, turning to Mr. Bell for confirmation of the sad suspicion that now entered her mind. "There was a gentleman here in the spring, must have been as long ago as last winter, who told us a deal of Mr. Hale and Miss Margaret, and he said Mrs. Hale was gone, poor lady, but never a word of the vicar's being ailing." "It is so, however," said Mr. Bell. "He died quite suddenly when on a visit to me at Oxford. He was a good man. There's many of us that might be thankful to have as common an end as his, Mrs. Purkis. Come, Margaret, my dear. Her father was my oldest friend, and she is my goddaughter, so I thought we might just come down together and see the old place. And I know of old you can give us comfortable rooms and a capital dinner. You don't remember me, I see, but my name is Bell, and once or twice when the parsonage has been full, I've slept here and tasted your good ale." "To be sure, I ask your pardon, but as you see, I was taken up with Miss Hale. Let me show you to a room, Miss Margaret, where you can take off your bonnet and wash your face. It's only this morning I plunged some fresh-gathered roses downward in the water jug, for I thought perhaps someone will be coming, and there's nothing so sweet as spring water scented by a musk rose or two. To think the vicar being dead. Well, to be sure, we must all die, only that gentleman said he was quite picking up after his trouble about Mrs. Hale's death. Come down to me, Mrs. Purkis, after you attended Miss Hale. I want to have a consultation with you about dinner." The little casement window in Margaret's bedchamber was almost filled up with rose and vine branches, but pushing them aside and stretching a little out, she could see the tops of the parsonage chimneys above the trees and distinguish many a well-known line through their leaves. "Aye," said Mrs. Purkis, smoothing down the bed and dispatching Jenny for an armful of lavender-scented towels. "Times has changed, miss. Our new vicar has 7 children and is building a nursery ready for more, just where the arbor and tool house used to be in old times. And he has had his new grates put in and a plate-glass window in the drawing-room. He and his wife are stirring people and have done a good deal of good. At least they say it's doing good. If I were not, I should call it turning things upside down for very little purpose. New vicar's a teetotaler, miss, and a magistrate, and his wife has a great deal of receipts in economical cooking, and is for making bread without yeast, and they both talk so much and both at a time that they knock one down, as it were, And it's not till they're done, and one's a little at peace, that one can think that there were things that one might have said on one's own side of the opinion. He'll be after the man's cans in the hayfield, and peeping in, and there'll be an ado because it's not ginger beer. I can't help it. My mother and my grandmother before sent me good malt liquor to haymakers and took salts and senna when anything ailed 'em. And I must even go on in their ways, though Mrs. Hepworth does want to give me comforts instead of medicine, which, as she says, is a good deal pleasanter, only I've no faith in it. I must go, miss, though I'm wanting to hear many a thing. I'll come back to you before long. Mr. Bell had strawberries and cream, a loaf of brown bread, and a jug of milk, together with a Stilton cheese and a bottle of port for his own private refreshment, ready for Margaret on her coming downstairs. And after this rustic luncheon did they set out on a walk, hardly knowing in which direction to turn. So many old familiar inducements were there in each. "Shall we go past the vicarage?" asked Mr. Bell. "No, not yet. We will go this way and make a round as to come back by it," said Margaret. Here and there, the old trees had been felled by the autumn before, or a squatter's cottage roughly built and decaying cottage had disappeared. Margaret missed each and all and grieved over them like old friends. They came past the spot where she and Mr. Lennox had sketched. The white, lightning-scarred trunk of the venerable beech, among whose roots they had sat down, there was no more. The old man, the inhabitant of the ruinous cottage, was dead, and the cottage had been pulled down, and a new one, tidy and respectable, had been built in its stead. There was a small garden on the place where the beech tree had been. "I did not think I'd been so old," said Margaret, after a pause of silence, and she turned away, sighing. "Yes," said Mr. Bell, "it is the first changes among familiar things that make such a mystery of time to the young. Afterwards we lose the sense of the mysterious. I take changes in all I see as a matter of course. The instability of all human things is familiar to me. To you it is new and oppressive." "Let us go on to see little Susan," said Margaret, drawing her companion up a grassy roadway, leading under the shadow of a forest glade. "With all my heart, though I have not an idea who little Susan may be, but I have a kindness for all Susans for simple Susan's sake." "My little Susan was disappointed when I left without wishing her goodbye, and it's been on my conscience ever since that I gave her pain which a little more exertion on my part might have prevented. But it is a long way. Are you sure you will not be tired?" "Oh, quite sure. That is, if you don't walk so fast. You see, here there are no views that can give one an excuse for stopping to take breath. You would think it romantic to be walking with a person, fat and scant of breath, if I were Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. Have compassion on my infirmities, for his sake." "I will walk slower for your own sake. I like you 20 times better than Hamlet." "On the principle that a living ass is better than a dead lion." "Perhaps so. I don't analyze my feelings." "I am content to take your liking me without examining too curiously into the materials it is made of. Only we need not walk at a snail's pace." "Very well. Walk at your own pace and I will follow. Or stop still and meditate like the Hamlet you compare yourself to if I go too fast." "Thank you, but as my mother has not murdered my father and afterwards married my uncle, I shouldn't know what to think about unless it were balancing the chances of our having a well-cooked dinner or not. What do you think?" "I am in good hopes. She used to be considered a famous cook as far as Helston opinion went." "But have you considered the distraction of mind produced by all the haymaking?" Margaret felt all Mr. Bell's kindness in trying to make cheerful talk about nothing, to endeavor to prevent her from thinking too curiously about the past. But she would have rather gone over these dear, loved walks in silence, if indeed she were not ungrateful enough to wish she might have been alone. They reached the cottage where Susan's widowed mother lived. Susan was not there. She was gone to the parochial school. Margaret was disappointed, and the poor woman saw it and began to make a kind of apology. "Oh, it is quite all right," said Margaret. "I'm very glad to hear it. I might have thought of it, only she used to stop at home with you." "Yes, she did, and I miss her sadly. I used to teach her what little I knew at nights. It were not much, to be sure, but she were getting such a handy girl that I miss her sore. She's a good deal above me in learning now. And the mother sighed. I'm all wrong, growled Mr. Bell. Don't mind what I say. I'm 100 years behind the world. But I should say that the child was getting a better and simpler and more natural education, stopping at home and helping her mother and learning to read a chapter every night by her mother's side than from all the schooling under the sun. Margaret did not want to encourage him to go on by replying to him, and so prolonging the discussion before the mother. So she turned to her and asked, How is old Betty Barnes? I don't know, said the woman rather shortly. We's not friends. Why not? Asked Margaret, who had formerly been the peacemaker of the village. She stole my cat. Did she know it was yours? I don't know. I reckon not. Well, could you not get it back again when you told her it was yours? No, she'd be burnt for it. For she'd burnt it. Burnt it? Exclaimed both Margaret and Mr. Bell. Roasted it, explained the woman. It was no explanation. By dint of questioning, Margaret extracted from her the horrible fact that Betty Barnes, having been induced to lend the latter her husband's Sunday clothes, on promise of having them faithfully returned on the Saturday night before Goodman Barnes should have missed them, became alarmed by their non-appearance, and her consequent dread of her husband's anger, and as, according to one of the savage country superstitions, the cries of a cat in the agonies of being boiled or roasted alive, compelled, as it were, the powers of darkness to fulfill the wishes of the executioner, resort had been had to the charm. The poor woman evidently believed in its efficacy. Her only feeling was indignation that her cat had been chosen from all the others for a sacrifice. Margaret listened with horror and endeavored in vain to enlighten the woman's mind, but she was obliged to give it up in despair. Step by step, she got the woman to admit certain facts on which the logical connection and sequence was perfectly clear to Margaret. But at the end, the bewildered woman simply repeated her first assertion, namely that it were very cruel for sure and she should not like to do it, but there was nothing like it for giving a person what they wished for. She had heard it all her life, but it were very cruel for all that. Margaret gave it up in despair and walked away sick at heart. You are a good girl not to triumph over me, said Mr. Bell. How? What do you mean? I own I am wrong about schooling. Anything rather than have that child brought up in such practical paganism. Oh, I remember. Poor little Susan. I must go see her. Would you mind calling at the school? Not a bit. I am curious to see something of the teaching she is to receive. They did not speak much more, but threaded their way through many a bosky dell, whose soft green influence could not charm away the shock and the pain in Margaret's heart caused by the recital of such cruelty. A recital, too, the manner of which betrayed such utter want of imagination, and therefore of any sympathy with the suffering animal. The buzz of voices, like the murmur of a hive of busy human bees, made itself heard as soon as they emerged from the forest on the more open village green on which the school was situated. The door was wide open, and they entered. A brisk lady in black here, there, and everywhere perceived them and bade them welcome with somewhat of a hostess air, which, Margaret remembered, her mother was wont to assume, only a more soft and languid manner when any rare visitors strayed in to inspect the school. She knew at once it was the present vicar's wife, her mother's successor, and she would have drawn back from the interview had it been possible, but in an instant she had conquered this feeling and modestly advanced, meeting many a bright glance of recognition and hearing many a half-suppressed murmur of, "It's Miss Hale." The vicar's lady heard the name, and her manner at once became more kindly. Margaret wished she could have helped feeling that it also became more patronizing. The lady held out a hand to Mr. Bell with, "Your father, I presume, Miss Hale. I see by the likeness. I am sure I am very glad to see you, sir, and so will the vicar be." Margaret explained that this was not her father, and stammered out the fact of his death, wondering all the time how Mr. Hale could have borne coming to revisit Helston, if it had been as the vicar's lady supposed. She did not hear what Mrs. Hepworth was saying and left it to Mr. Bell to reply, looking round meanwhile for old acquaintances. I see you would like to take a class, Miss Hale. I know it by myself. First class stand up for parsing lessons with Miss Hale. Poor Margaret, whose visit was sentimental, not in any degree inspective, felt herself taken in, but as in some way bringing her in contact with little eager faces, once well known, who had received the solemn rite of baptism from her father. She sat down, half losing herself in tracing out the changing features of the girls and holding Susan's hand for a minute or two, unobserved by all, while the first class sought for their books, and the vicar's lady went as near as a lady could towards holding Mr. Bell by the button while she explained the phonetic system to him and gave him a conversation she had with the inspector about it. Margaret bent over her book and seeing nothing but that, hearing the buzz of children's voices, old times rose up, and she thought of them, and her eyes filled with tears, till all at once there was a pause. One of the girls was stumbling over the apparently simple word, uncertain what to call it. An indefinite article, said Margaret mildly. I beg your pardon, said the vicar's wife, all eyes and ears, but we are taught by Mr. Milson to call an, who can remember? An adjective absolute, said half a dozen voices at once. And Margaret sat abashed. The children knew more than she did. Mr. Bell turned away and smiled. Margaret spoke no more during the lesson, but after it was over, she went quietly round to one or two old favorites and talked to them a little. They were growing out of children into great girls, passing out of their recollection into their rapid development, as she, by her 3 years' absence, was vanishing from theirs. Still, she was glad to have seen them all again, though a tinge of sadness mixed itself with her pleasure. When school was over for the day, it was yet early in the summer afternoons, and Mrs. Hepworth proposed to Margaret that she and Mr. Bell accompany her to the parsonage and see— the word improvements had half slipped out of her mouth, and she substituted the more cautious term, alterations, which the present vicar was making. Margaret did not care a straw about seeing the alterations, which jarred upon her fond recollection of what her home had once been, but she longed to see the old place once more, even though she shivered away from the pain which she knew she would feel. The parsonage was so altered, both inside and out, that the real pain was less than she anticipated. It was not like the same place. The garden, the grass plat formerly so daintily trimmed that even a stray rose leaf seemed like a fleck on the exquisite arrangement and propriety, was strewed with children's things. A bag of marbles here, a hoop there, a straw hat forced down upon a rose tree as on a peg, to the destruction of a long, beautiful, tender branch of flowers, which in former days would have been trained up tenderly as if beloved. The little square matted hall was equally filled with signs of merry, healthy, rough childhood. Said Mrs. Hepworth, you must excuse this untidiness, Miss Hale. When the nursery is finished, I shall insist upon a little order. We are building a nursery out of your room, I believe. How did you manage, Miss Hale, without a nursery? We were but 2, said Margaret. You have many children, I presume. 7. Look here, we are throwing out a window to the road on this side. Mr. Hepworth is spending an immense deal of money on this house, but really it was scarcely habitable when we came. For so large a family as ours, I mean. Of course. Every room in the house was changed, besides the one of which Mrs. Hepworth spoke, which had been Mr. Hale's study formerly, and where the green gloom and delicious quiet of the place had conduced, as he had said, to a habit of meditation, but perhaps in some degree to the formation of a character more fitted for thought than action. The new window gave a view of the road, and had many advantages, as Mrs. Hepworth pointed out. From the wandering sheep of her husband's flock might be seen, who straggled to the tempting beer house, unobserved as they might hope, but not unobserved in reality, for the active vicar kept his eye on the road, even during the composition of his most orthodox sermons, and had a hat and stick ready at hand to seize before sallying out after his parishioners, who had need of quick legs if they could take refuge in the jolly forester before the teetotal vicar arrested them. The whole family were quick, brisk, loud-talking, kind-hearted, and not troubled with much delicacy of perception. Margaret feared that Mrs. Hepworth would find out Mr. Bell was playing upon her in the admiration he thought fit to express for everything that especially grated on his taste. But no, she took it all literally, and with such good faith that Margaret could not help remonstrating with him as they walked slowly from the parsonage back to their inn. "Don't scold, Margaret. It was all because of you. If she had not shown you every change with such evident exultation in their superior sense in perceiving what an improvement this and that would be, I could have behaved well. But you must go on preaching. If you must go on preaching, keep it till after dinner, when it will send me to sleep and help my digestion." They were both of them tired, and Margaret herself so much so that she was unwilling to go out as she had proposed to do, and have another ramble among the woods and fields so close to the home of her childhood. And somehow this visit to Helston had not been exactly what she had expected. There was change everywhere, slight yet pervading all. Households were changed through absence, death, marriage, or the natural mutations brought by days and months and years which carry us imperceptibly from childhood to youth, and thence through manhood to age, whence we drop like fruit, fully ripe into the quiet Mother Earth. Places were changed, a tree gone here, a bough there, bringing in a long ray of light where no light was before. A road was trimmed and narrowed, and the green, straggling pathway by its side enclosed and cultivated. A great improvement, it was called, but Margaret sighed over the old picturesqueness, the old gloom, and the grassy wayside of former days. She sat by the window on the little settle, sadly gazing out on the gathering shades of night, which harmonized well with her pensive thought. Mr. Bell slept soundly after his unusual exercise throughout the day. At last he was roused by the entrance of the tea tray, brought in by a flushed-looking country girl who had evidently been finding some variety from her unusual occupation of waiter in assisting the day in the hayfield. "Hello? Who's there? What are we?"